They thought tariffs would silence a continent. They thought shackles could be disguised as policy. Yet from Ouagadougou, a voice rose that cut through the illusion. A soldier turned president who refused to kneel. When Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on Africa's lifelines, gold, cocoa, cotton, the food that feeds families, Washington expected panic, petitions, and desperate negotiations. What it received instead was defiance. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso did not bargain. He did not hesitate. He stood before the world and said no. In that instant, the balance of power shifted, not in numbers or weapons, but in dignity. For the first time in a generation, Africa answered back, not with pleading, but with pride. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is the sound of sovereignty waking. Subscribe now and walk with us through a story that may redraw the map of tomorrow. Because the question is not whether one nation can resist. The question is what happens when an entire continent chooses to stand. For decades, Washington had perfected a script. When persuasion failed, when diplomacy faltered, when respect could no longer be demanded, it reached for the bluntest instrument in its arsenal: tariffs. They called it economics. Africans knew it as a chain. Year after year, gold was weighed, cocoa counted, cotton measured, and the price of Africa's dignity was reduced to a tax code. When Donald Trump re-emerged with a fresh wave of tariffs, the logic was the same as it had been in the 1980s. Target the lifelines: raw gold from the Sahel, cocoa from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, cotton from the valleys, textiles woven by fragile hands, and food staples destined for foreign shelves. The calculation was cold. Apply pressure, let the economies choke, and wait for leaders to crawl back with petitions for exemptions. But this time something broke. The playbook that had shackled Africa for generations was met not with fear, but with fire. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré, still in his 30s, stood before the world with words that were not polished by Western advisors or drafted by international consultants. He spoke as a soldier, as a man of dust and sweat, and declared that Burkina Faso would not kneel to tariff blackmail. His tone was not diplomatic. It was absolute. The statement reverberated. For a landlocked nation of barely 22 million, dependent for decades on external markets, this was more than a policy announcement. It was a rupture. Washington expected petitions. What it received was rejection. And not only rejection, rejection without hesitation. The tariffs themselves were designed as a hammer, but Traoré treated them as hollow. Africa will not mortgage its dignity for access to a market built on shifting sands, he declared. With those words, a nation once dismissed as peripheral became the epicenter of a storm. And then came the speed. Within 72 hours of Trump's announcement, Traoré had mobilized 34 African nations into emergency trade coordination. Gold shipments earmarked for American refineries were rerouted to Moscow. Agricultural exports once bound for American supermarkets were redirected to Asian markets hungry for supply. The shield of multipolarity, built over a decade through the African Continental Free Trade Area, through BRICS partnerships, through quiet bilateral agreements, suddenly revealed its strength. For Trump, the humiliation was sharp. For years, he had wielded tariffs like a club, against China, against Mexico, against Europe, and each time he had extracted concessions. But here was Burkina Faso, a so-called small player, refusing to bend. The shock was not only that Traoré said no, but that Africa, for once, did not scatter. It closed ranks. In Ouagadougou, crowds poured into the streets. They did not cheer as if at a rally. They roared as if unshackled. It was not applause. It was catharsis. For once, Africa was not waiting for a stronger power to grant leniency. It was watching one of its own slam the door in the face of coercion. Yet in Washington, disbelief turned to fury. Reports spoke of late-night meetings in the White House, of advisors weighing retaliation, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, pressure through allies. But the deeper fear was not about Burkina Faso's trade. It was about precedent. If this small nation could refuse and survive, what might Nigeria do? What might South Africa attempt? What if the fear that had held the continent in check was collapsing? Traoré had not simply blocked tariffs. He had punctured an illusion. The illusion that Africa was still hostage to one market, still trapped in one cycle of dependency. His refusal revealed the fragility of assumptions long treated as unshakable. And so, a battle that began with tariffs was no longer about numbers, exports, or percentages. It had become a battle over dignity. And dignity, once awakened, is the hardest force to suppress. But the question lingered, sharper than any statistic. If a soldier president from Ouagadougou could defy the weight of Washington, what storm was about to sweep across the rest of Africa? The roar in Ouagadougou was not the polite applause of a press conference. It was thunder. When Ibrahim Traoré rejected Washington's tariffs, the city erupted in a chorus that felt less like celebration and more like release. For decades, Burkina Faso's people had watched leaders sign agreements that bled their soil dry. They had endured the humiliation of exporting gold while living in poverty, of growing cotton yet wearing imported rags. Now, in one moment, they felt the weight lift. The atmosphere was electric. Chants of sovereignty echoed in the streets. Women danced in markets. Soldiers saluted not with ceremony but with pride. And students carried placards declaring that Africa would not beg. The rejection of tariffs had become a rejection of silence. In Washington, the mood could not have been more different. Reports described the atmosphere inside the White House as fury bordering on disbelief. Donald Trump, who thrived on dominance, found himself defied not by Beijing or Brussels, but by Ouagadougou. For him, humiliation was personal. The image of strength he cultivated was pierced by a nation that American media had long dismissed as irrelevant. Advisors scrambled. Sanctions were drafted on paper, scenarios of diplomatic isolation discussed, threats rehearsed. Yet beneath the noise, a deeper unease took root. If Burkina Faso could stand and survive, what would stop Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa from daring the same? The nightmare was not about trade losses. It was about precedent, the collapse of fear. Across Africa, the symbolism spread faster than any commodity. Leaders who had once hesitated to defy Washington now saw a living example that resistance did not mean ruin. In Ghana, commentators spoke of a new dawn. In Senegal, youth movements hailed Traoré as a generational voice. From Ethiopia to Tanzania, social media buzzed with memes of a soldier president who refused to kneel. And then came the international response. Russia moved swiftly, offering gold refining channels outside Western systems. China expanded purchasing agreements, absorbing shipments once bound for America. India opened its doors wider to African agriculture, filling its markets with maize and pulses. Even Brazil, often overlooked, offered to reroute trade southward in solidarity. What was meant to isolate had instead united. Tariffs designed to suffocate became the spark of new partnerships. In Europe, the divisions widened. The European Union, wary of losing influence entirely to Moscow and Beijing, quietly took in redirected exports. Brussels may not have echoed Traoré's fiery rhetoric, but it understood the cost of being left behind. At the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, not as a mere politician, but as a symbol. He was young, fiery, unpolished in the ways of Western diplomacy, and that was precisely his power. He did not couch his words in the language of compromise. He spoke as one who owed nothing to Washington, Paris, or Brussels. His words cut clean. Africa will not beg. We will not kneel. In that defiance, he embodied not only Burkina Faso, but a continent long silenced. He became Africa's David, standing before a Goliath whose power rested on assumption more than reality. And when the stone was thrown, the giant stumbled. Yet even as celebrations filled the streets, the question loomed. How long could defiance last? Could a nation as small as Burkina Faso withstand the fury of an empire long accustomed to obedience? Would the shield of multipolarity hold if pressure intensified? The cheers of Ouagadougou were loud, but in the corridors of Washington, strategies were already being sharpened. Sanctions, alliances, covert pressures. The arsenal was far from empty. The world was watching. The people of Africa were hoping. And in that fragile balance between celebration and uncertainty lay the next great turning point. Because the truth was clear. The defiance of one soldier president had lit a fire. But whether that fire would warm a continent or consume it was the question yet to be answered. When the dust of celebration began to settle, the harder work emerged. Rejecting tariffs was a statement. Living through the consequences was a test. In the markets of Ouagadougou, traders wondered whether their goods would find buyers. Families asked whether prices would rise. Farmers looked at their cotton fields and questioned if the world still wanted their harvest. Yet the weeks that followed revealed something unexpected. Instead of collapse, there was adaptation. Grain once earmarked for American supermarkets was sold across African borders. Gold that had flowed westward was redirected east. Textile producers, long squeezed by the volatility of foreign buyers, found opportunities in regional demand. It was not seamless. It was not painless. but it was survival on Africa's terms. For ordinary citizens, the refusal of tariffs carried more than economic meaning. It became personal. For decades, people had been told that sovereignty was too expensive, that dignity could not fill stomachs. Now, for the first time, they saw a leader who believed otherwise. The pride that filled Ouagadougou's streets was not just political theater. It was daily sustenance, a reminder that poverty had never been the natural order, but the product of choices imposed from outside. In the political arena, the impact was even sharper. Ibrahim Traoré, who had come to power in what many abroad labeled the Ibrahim Traoré coup, faced skepticism at first. Was he another young soldier seizing authority, or a genuine voice for change? The tariff rejection gave him an answer. It was not just rhetoric. It was action that resonated with citizens who had grown weary of leaders signing contracts that enriched foreign companies while draining local resources. His legitimacy deepened not through international recognition, but through popular trust. The opposition, fragmented and hesitant, struggled to frame a critique. How could they argue against a stance that had ignited national pride? Critics abroad called him reckless. At home, he was hailed as courageous. The balance of power within Burkina Faso tilted decisively. For the first time in years, the people felt their government was not a distant authority, but a shield. Economically, the short term was rocky. Supply chains needed rerouting, contracts had to be renegotiated, and uncertainty lingered. Yet this turbulence also unlocked opportunities. Local industries began to receive state backing. Mining assets were brought under tighter national control. Agricultural self-sufficiency was not merely a slogan, but a necessity. The crisis became a catalyst for reforms that might have taken years under normal conditions. More importantly, the psychological shift was profound. Across the continent, leaders had long operated under a shadow of fear. Fear that defiance would bring ruin, that standing tall meant falling alone. Burkina Faso's stance cracked that shadow. Citizens in other African nations looked at Traoré and saw proof that sovereignty did not equal suicide. The narrative shifted from dependency to determination. International aid, once seen as lifeblood, began to look like a leash. Trade, not aid, became the rallying cry. And as the idea spread, so too did the demand for governments to follow suit. But challenges loomed. Burkina Faso remained vulnerable to external shocks. Inflation threatened. Security concerns, fueled by insurgencies in the Sahel, persisted. The West, though shaken, still held tools of pressure: financial systems, diplomatic isolation, covert influence. And so the question became, could one nation, however bold, sustain defiance in the face of a global order still dominated by the West? Could the shield of multipolarity truly hold when Washington decided to test its limits? The answer would not come from Burkina Faso alone. It would come from the continent, from alliances, from the willingness of others to follow the same path. Because if Traoré had proved one thing, it was this: the moment a people believe sovereignty is worth the cost, the calculus of power changes forever. But how would the wider world, allies, rivals, and skeptics alike, respond to this act of defiance? That was the question about to be tested on the global stage. In Washington, the rejection stung not only as a political setback, but as an affront to authority. Tariffs had been Trump's favorite weapon: blunt, heavy, devastating. Yet here they were, blunted by a landlocked nation that most American strategists had not even placed on their maps of consequence. The fury in political circles was palpable. Some spoke of new sanctions, others of diplomatic isolation. But beneath the anger lay unease. If the tool of tariffs could fail against Burkina Faso, where else might America's leverage collapse? Regional blocs watched with careful calculation. ECOWAS, long pressured to act as a Western buffer in West Africa, found itself caught. To openly condemn Traoré would have been to alienate populations already sympathetic to his defiance. To support him openly risked confrontation with Washington. The African Union, meanwhile, spoke in the language of unity. Sovereignty must be respected. Partnerships must be rebalanced. Words carefully chosen, but the undertone was unmistakable. The tide was shifting. Europe faced its own dilemma. The European Union, deeply tied to Washington, yet fearful of losing Africa entirely to Beijing and Moscow, quietly absorbed a portion of redirected exports. In Brussels, officials admitted privately that they could not afford to be left behind. Publicly, they called for dialogue. Privately, they recalculated strategy. It was outside the Western orbit, however, that the most decisive moves were made. Moscow seized the moment, offering gold refining and security agreements that bypassed Western systems entirely. Beijing stepped in with expanded trade contracts, treating Africa not as a client, but as a partner in necessity. New Delhi's markets opened wider for food staples, strengthening the loop between African producers and Indian consumers. Even Brasilia, often overlooked, positioned itself as a southern gateway for African exports. Together, these responses revealed a truth long in the making. Multipolarity was no longer a theory. It was a shield, a web of connections that meant no single Western capital could choke Africa into silence again. And at the center of this transformation stood the image of a young soldier president whose refusal had turned into a movement. Commentators across the continent began to speak of a Burkina Faso revolution, not a revolution of guns and barricades, but of posture and principle. A small state had stood up, and the world had answered. Yet the deeper question remained unresolved. Multipolarity had provided protection this time. But would it hold in the storms to come? Could Africa rely on these new partners without falling into another cycle of dependency? A different leash, but a leash nonetheless? The future path, filled with both danger and promise, was about to be tested. And the question was no longer if Africa could resist, but who would be next to join the stand. The rejection of tariffs was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. For Burkina Faso, and for Africa as a whole, the road ahead is paved with both peril and possibility. On one side, the risks are undeniable. Washington has not exhausted its arsenal. Financial sanctions, diplomatic isolation, pressure through multilateral institutions all remain within reach. The legacy of dependence cannot be erased overnight, and vulnerabilities linger in every corner of the continent's economies. Inflation, supply chain disruption, and security threats in the Sahel cast long shadows. Yet on the other side lies a path long dreamed of, but rarely pursued with conviction. A path where sovereignty is not a slogan but a structure. Where Africa chooses partners rather than being chosen. Where trade replaces aid and dignity replaces dependency. The defiance of tariffs could become a catalyst for deeper integration, strengthening the African continental free trade area, accelerating the Pan-African payment system, expanding intra-African commerce so that when external doors close, internal ones remain open. For Traoré, the test is now about more than a single stand. It is about proving that sovereignty can deliver prosperity. If he can channel the energy of defiance into concrete reforms in agriculture, mining, and education, he may set an example that ripples far beyond Burkina Faso. The question is no longer whether one soldier president can say no. It is whether an entire continent can say yes. Yes to unity, yes to self-reliance, yes to a future written in its own hand. The stakes are vast. If Africa succeeds, the global balance tilts toward true multipolarity. If it falters, critics will dismiss the moment as a reckless gamble. The choice lies not only with Traoré, but with the leaders and people of Africa who must decide whether this is a passing spark or a lasting flame. And perhaps the most profound truth is this: dignity, once tasted, is hard to surrender. Even if challenges grow, even if pressures mount, the memory of standing tall cannot be erased. Burkina Faso has shown that resistance is possible. Now the question spreads to Nigeria, to South Africa, to Kenya, to Egypt. Who will be next to claim the mantle of sovereignty? Because the road has been opened, and once a road is walked, it cannot be undone. The dawn has broken, but will it rise into day? History is rarely rewritten by the powerful. More often, it is shifted by the small, the underestimated, the overlooked. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation dismissed for decades as peripheral, has shown the world that dignity is not measured in GDP or population size. It is measured in the courage to say no. Ibrahim Traoré's stand against tariffs was more than a policy decision. It was a signal, a reminder that sovereignty is not granted, it is claimed. What many abroad once dismissed as the Ibrahim Traoré coup now appears, in the eyes of millions across Africa, as the beginning of a wider awakening. He did not merely seize power. He seized the moment. The ripples are spreading. Across Africa, citizens demand leaders who will no longer trade sovereignty for aid. Across the global south, nations see in this defiance a blueprint for resisting old hierarchies. Even in Western capitals, policymakers are forced to admit what was once unthinkable. The fear that kept Africa compliant is eroding. And yet the story is not about one man alone. It is about a continent finding its voice. The so-called Burkina Faso revolution is not a revolution of guns, but of posture, a refusal to kneel, a declaration that trade cannot be used as chains. If one small nation can stand, what stops the rest? Of course, challenges remain. The structures of dependency are not dismantled in a day. But the precedent has been set. A leader has looked Washington in the eye and said no, and the sky did not fall. Instead, a door opened. So the question is no longer whether Africa can endure. It is whether Africa will choose to walk through that open door together into a future defined not by charity, but by choice, not by pity, but by partnership. If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and walk with us into the unfolding story of Africa's sovereignty. Because this is not the end of the Ibrahim Traoré coup. It is the beginning of something larger. And history may remember it not as a headline, but as the spark that lit Africa's dawn.